how do we find that common ground and the need to indigenize was the term that you borrowed from Walls. I would like to say the affirmation and the challenge, the antithesis, little triangle, little Kuiper there. What's the bridge in, and what's the way the gospel challenges it? But how do we go about doing that in a world that, number one, is open? They have a framework, some do, but yeah, let's start with there. In a world that is at least open, but yet we don't have necessarily a common language to bridge.
Yeah, I use that Walls, his history of missiology. And let me back up and say, I'm coming at this from my work in patristics and early church. And, you do that work. And what I love is I get into the missiological literature and I realize so much of the good work happening in that literature is now helping me to make sense of what's happening. So I had to get up to speed. I've read Andrew Walls, I've heard Andrew Walls speak, but when I read that history of missiology, I then compared it. Vince Bantu also wrote a work in which he cites Walls, and he uses the language cultural sanctification, which is one kind of connection or link point with the title of the book. But when I'm describing cultural sanctification, I'm using Walls' categories of simultaneous indigenizing and pilgrim. So he's talking about every time Christianity takes root in a culture, it's oscillating between those things as it takes on the forms and features of the culture. It's indigenizing, drawing on the forms and features of the culture, but then always maintaining a distinction and a uniqueness that is never fully enmeshed in the culture. And those kinds of things have waxed and waned as Christianity has taken root in a whole variety of cultures. And so that's why Walls was so helpful for me to start to make sense of that, because that's what I was seeing happening in the second and third century. And this gets back to your question, I think gets back to why catechesis is so important, because once you form those first tier things, those first principle things, what is Christian orthodoxy? What is liturgy? That's why I use the language of the rule of faith. These are early creedal confessions. So Matthew 28:19, the Great Commission texts, baptize them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. In the book, I talk about how those titles provide you a resume for early Christian confession. Who is the Father? Who is the Son? Who is the Spirit? This is what you confess at baptism. And this is what you confess as you become a member of the people of God and in the family of God. So once we start to get those first principle things, we start to then take up shop in a culture, and we can start to evaluate and navigate the virtues and the vices of a culture, of the institutions there, as we see the way they either help to proclaim or they latch up with what the gospel proclaims. We use those forms and features to explain the Christian gospel. So that's how I think this is why catechesis and formation is so important, because it forms those first principle things that then when we embed ourselves in the culture, we can have conversations. I think even some of our conversations are about pop culture, or some good illustrations of this, where we can say, we can sift the wheat and the tares, and we can start to see. I'll give you an example of the way this happened in the early church. They would often read the philosophers. They would read Platonism. They would read Stoicism. And they would say, look, here are the weaknesses, and this is the telos of the worldview that you have. Let me show you a better path. But that knowing some of that allows that kind of discourse, missiological discourse, to go on. So those are some of the things that I see happening in the early church and today too.
Well, Keller, I think, mentioned that too. He said you earned social capital by being able to explain someone's position to them in a way that they themselves agree with.
Yep.